Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Completionist. Anyway guys, first of all, I apologize for my very hobo look. I got about a little less than a month left before I have to go back to work. And in my workplace, a lot of the sites that I go to, requires me to be clean shaven. So this is pretty much an idea from my wife. She actually wants to see me grow a beard. So I actually kept myself pretty baby-faced for the for the majority of the time that I was home. But anyone who's been married a long time knows that whatever the wifey wants, the wifey gets. So she wants me to have a beard, so it's slowly growing out. I'm kind of getting a little accustomed to it, even though I don't really grow facial hair. So we'll see how it looks at the end of the month. So anyway guys, for this video, what I wanted to talk about is I wanted to talk about my favorite game of all time again, which is Xenogears. And for the last couple of years, I've been a part of the Xenogears Facebook group. I think it's the biggest Xenogears Facebook group online. And there's been some new information coming out that's getting people a little excited, even though there's been no confirmation. But a lot of people on the group, want a Xenogears Remake. Because two articles that have come out lately is that a new video game studio wants to revitalize some of Square Enix's old IPs. And there's also been word that Yasunori Mitsuda, who's the composer for Chrono Cross and Xenogears, is starting a big full-scale project there in April. But as much as Xenogears fans are getting excited about this news, about maybe the slight prospect that Xenogears might get remade, I wanted to make a video talking about my personal feelings about it, and more specifically, I want to talk about why I don't want a Xenogears remake. That's actually quite surprising, for me to say that, because Xenogears is my favorite game of all time. So why wouldn't I like to see it, remade? So that original fans of the Xenogears franchise, get to relive their memories again. And it can also be a way for new fans to jump into Xenogears and the Xenogears universe. My feelings based on this, I'm pretty much basing this on what I took out of the Final Fantasy VII remake. Because I've often said before that if it wasn't the success of Final Fantasy VII, we wouldn't have had the huge influx of JRPGs, hit Western shores if it wasn't for the success of that game. Xenogears was this close to not even making it to North America because of its questionable subject matter. And if Final Fantasy VII wasn't as successful as it was, then maybe we wouldn't have got Xenogears altogether. And I'm eternally thankful to Final Fantasy VII. For being as big and as popular as it was, because if it wasn't for the success of that game, then we wouldn't have had the amazing lineup of JRPGs that were released for the PS1. Personally, for me guys, Xenogears is a product of its time. I think it's a game that the world needed when it was released in 1998. And it's a game that I hold very dear to my heart because even beyond the things that make Xenogears great, it doesn't matter if it's its music, its mature subject matter, its storyline, its characters. I think it was a game that the JRPG world really needed in 1998. And in all honesty, I think the game is probably better off being left in that timeline. Xenogears was such a huge, memorable experience for me. And it really solidified my love of JRPGs, because it was one of probably the first 3 to 5 JRPGs that I've ever played for PlayStation 1. But strangely enough, I played, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, I think Final Fantasy VII was the first JRPG I played for the PlayStation 1. But on the skin surface, I love the Xenogears because I was a huge old school anime fan. And to play an RPG where you could play giant mechs sounded like such an awesome idea. And I thought, okay, so you're playing a turn-based combat, but you get to use these giant robots? Sweet. I was sold already. Didn't matter what the storyline was. But the thing is that for me, what I'm worried about is that if Xenogears ended up getting remade, I think it would cheapen what the original game did when it was released in 1998. Now, why do I say that? The thing is guys, like, it's, as I said in the very beginning of the video, I love Final Fantasy VII. It holds a special place in my heart, probably top 5 Final Fantasy games of all time. And it really left a memorable place in my life. But one thing that I noticed last year when I played the Final Fantasy VII Remake, did it have the same impact on me that the original did when I first played it? And the sad reality is, it didn't. For as great as the game was, for as beautiful as the game was, it was pretty much telling the same story that I already experienced once before. Even though, you know, they did a few different things to kind of switch things up a bit, you know, they added a few things. And, you know, even though that was great, it just didn't replicate the same feelings that I had when I played Final Fantasy VII for the first time. And, you know, regardless, seeing the same scenarios as the original game with brand new beautiful graphics and a much more in-depth, you know, action-based battle system, it just didn't give me like the same wonderful feeling that I had when I played the original Final Fantasy VII for the first time. And I'm afraid that if they ever do decide to remake Xenogears, regardless of what they do or the amount of budget that they put behind it, I don't think it's going to even come close of replicating the original feeling that I had when I played that game for the first time. If they ever did decide to remake Xenogears, I'm sure it'll be beautiful, I'm sure it'll sound great, I'm sure it'll look great. But ultimately, it's still retelling the same story that you know, that we've already experienced once before. And I kind of get this feeling that no matter how many times a story gets retold, that it's never going to have the same impact on your life as what it did when you experienced it for the very first time. Now, am I against remakes? No, I'm not. And the thing is that I can't be selfish and think that this is the best move for the Xenogears franchise. I can't. This is just my personal beliefs on it. And I just think it's just one of those games that's just better off left in the past, and for it to be revered as the timeless classic as it is. But I can definitely understand, you know, why Xenogears fans, you know, would want to see a remake. Personally, I'm just grateful that, you know, Square Enix still acknowledges, you know, that the game still exists. You know, I think over the last couple of years we've been pretty grateful, you know, to get as much Xenogears merchandise, you know, as we have. You know, it's, you know, we've had action figures come out, you know, we've had a brand new vinyl record come out for it, we've had the Xenogears anniversary concert You can get a licensed copy of the Sophia painting, and now they have Xenogears model kits. And it's kind of amazing that, you know, when the game first came out in 1998, you know, personally, I don't even think it was that big to begin with, because it took a really long time for that game to gain popularity. You know, it got released in 1998, and eventually, after a long time, you know, it got released as a greatest hits. But now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but when the game was first released, it was a Squaresoft title. But by the time the game had sold enough units, in order for it to be greatest hits, it was a Square Enix title. So Square and Enix had joined by the time Xenogears had sold enough copies for it to be considered a greatest hit. So it really took a long time for the game to really find its audience. And for those that did get a chance to play it, they hold it in high regard. Because for me, my personal beliefs is, like, I don't believe there is such thing as a perfect game. No game is ultimately perfect. And a game can be perfect to an individual, but it can't be perfect to everybody as a whole. And for me, there are problems with Xenogears. I will be the first to admit that. Obviously, the biggest one is the second disc, and how it's much more story focused than gameplay focused. And ultimately, it's a unfinished product. They did what they did with the amount of time that they had, and you know, for what they did, I thought they did wonderfully. So it's not a perfect masterpiece to everyone, but it's a masterpiece to me. It's a flawed masterpiece, but it's still a masterpiece to me and many of the other Xenogears fans out there. And I think that if they ever did decide to remake Xenogears, would I be excited? I think I'd be cautious. I think I'd have cautious optimism. Would I still play it? Sure. Would I still look up stuff on it? Sure. But it's much like I said about Final Fantasy VII. It's that I feel that the original game had more of an impact on video games as a whole than what a remake ever did. And I kind of feel like Xenogears would be in that same trap. That Xenogears wouldn't have the impact that it would have when it was remade than what it had when it was originally made. And it's just that if it ever does get remade, personally, I would play it. I would give it a fair shot. But it's going to be very hard for a remake to give me such a profound impact as what the original did. But I totally don't reject the idea. Like I said, I'm not going to be one of those selfish, self-entitled people that think that I know what's best for the Xenogears franchise, because frankly, I don't. You know, I'm just as big of a fan as Xenogears as everyone else. You know, I have quite a few game items from the series, anything from action figures to vinyl records to posters and guidebooks and the Perfect Works book and everything else. And that game will always hold a special place in my heart. And it has been my favorite game of all time, and I highly doubt, you know, anything will ever beat that. So does that really mean that I don't want Square Enix to do anything more with the Xenogears franchise? No, that's not simply the case. It's, you know, I would love to see them make the original game more accessible to everybody so that everybody can get a chance to play it. But it's like I said before, you know, it's not a perfect game. You know, sometimes there are issues with the camera. Sometimes it's very easy to get lost in the game. Some of the battles can be incredibly frustrating if you don't know what to do. You know, there's an area of the game that if you save, that, you know, if you don't prepare yourself adequately, you know, you could be stuck in a boss fight that, you know, you might not even be able to beat and actually progress through the game even further. But personally, what I would like to see done with the Xenogears franchise is that instead of spending all this money on a remake, because the harsh reality is to remake a game with present day graphics would take a ton of money. And I don't think any video game company should ever take the risk of remaking an older game, because I believe it's a huge financial risk. And despite, despite however many fans of Xenogears there are, I don't think putting tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into a remake, I don't think that they would ever be able to recoup the costs. Personally, what I would like to see done with the Xenogears franchise is that I would love for the series to keep the graphics it has now, because I think that's some of its charm, and it's like I said before, like what makes Xenogears really enjoyable is that it is a product of its time. Personally, it's a 6-part story saga, and we only got part 5. Personally, I would love for them to go back into the Xenogears story, regardless if it's in the past or if it's in the future, and tell more of the story. And personally, I think that would be the best way to go. They don't even have to use the most up-to-date graphics. It's just that, if they kept the game looking like how a lot of PSP JRPGs looked, I think that would be completely fine. I think there's obviously, some improvements they can make with regards to the camera and other things, but personally, I would love to see Xenogears get more story told. I'd love to see, instead of having part 5 of the Xenogears storyline retold again, let's go to part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 6. Who knows? Because the mythology that was built around this entire universe is so vast, and I'm sure that to tell the overall Xenogears storyline, I think they're better off going with a new entry than just trying to remake the same entry. And personally, that's how I think Xenogears should go. It's I think I'm probably one of the few that doesn't want Xenogears to be remade, just because I hold the game close to my heart. And personally, I think any attempt to remake it, I think cheapens the overall experience. And I'm really basing that, as I said before, on what the Final Fantasy VII remake did for me. While I hold the original Final Fantasy VII in such high regard, the original game had much more of an impact on me than what the remake did. Despite the remake looking beautiful and playing great, it just didn't hold a candle to what the original did for me. And I often have this belief that, I don't believe that games age terribly. Sometimes I believe it's our attitudes that often age terribly. And I think, when we go back and play older games for the first time, we have to tell ourselves that this was revolutionary for the time that it was made. It may not live up to the expectations of what gamers have for video games nowadays, especially since video games have evolved so much. But I always understand that when it comes to playing an older game, that it is a product of its time. And that's why there aren't really a lot of things that really annoy me about video games per se. And I tend to be a lot more forgiving towards things about video games that would drive other people crazy, such as long load times or really long cutscenes or poor gameplay mechanics or anything like that. I just survive and adapt the best I can. So ultimately, guys, those are my thoughts on why I really don't want a Xenogears remake. But if it does happen, I look forward to seeing what they do with it, if it does happen. But for now, I'm perfectly happy just playing the classic game and treasuring those memories that I had for that game for when I played it for the very first time. So anyway, guys, that takes care of another episode of The Completionist. So as always, take care, and I wish you nothing but the best. Later.